Genesis chapter 26. We're going to look at Isaac and Abimelech. Acts 17:11 reminds us to receive the word with great eagerness, but examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. Don't take anyone's word for it, but check these things out for yourself. Now we'll get into our blessing. Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us and commands us to immerse ourselves in the words of Torah. And we're going to find out just like Abraham did. Sweeten the words of your Torah in our mouths. Blessed are you, Lord, giver of the Torah. Amen. We'll talk about whether we're halfway through Genesis or not. I'll have some little fun little exercise for us. And then we'll look at Isaac's relocation to Gerar. There's another famine in the land. And then he's going to be met by the Lord who says, don't go to Egypt. Don't be like your father. And we'll look at what's going on there. Again, we have the story of Isaac telling Abimelech that their brother and sister, when Abimelech finds out they're married, of course. And then we'll see some disputes over water rights. We'll have the Lord appearing again. And then this time Isaac builds an altar, which is interesting. Why didn't he do it the first time? Treaty with Abimelech again. Abimelech says, you become too powerful. Let's make peace. And then he'll conclude with this rather seemingly out of place statement about Esau and taking foreign wives. But I think there's a very deliberate reason that it is put in that particular location at the end of 26. You might remember the story we told a few lessons back about Jewish thought being like the two men who fell through a chimney. So the story goes, two men fall through a chimney. One is dirty, the other's clean. Which one takes a bath? And then we saw that depending on your perspective, the answer changes all the time. So in the same way, let's ask the following question. What is the halfway point in Genesis? Are we there yet? Most of us would probably note that Genesis has 50 chapters, so chapter 26 marks the second half of the book. This makes sense, right? We finished 25 chapters, we have 25 chapters to go, so by this logic, are we halfway through the book? And to quote our two men fall through a chimney story, the answer is no. Because we can add up the total verses, which is easy to do. We just look at the last verse number of chapter 1, which is 31, and add it to the number of verses in chapter 2, which is 25, and so on and so forth. And we come up with 1,533 verses. Then we divide that by 2. We count until we reach 766 verses. That actually turns out to be Genesis 25, verse 20. So then the halfway point in Genesis must be between verse 20 and verse 21 of chapter 25, right? No. Using software, we can count 32,046 Hebrew words in the Leningrad Codex, which is the oldest and most authoritative version. We divide this by 2, we get 16,022, and we find that this occurs in Genesis 16, verse 8. So we passed the halfway point a long time ago in chapter 16, right? No! There are 78,064 Hebrew letters, so the halfway point must be the halfway between that, which is not until Genesis 27, verse 36. So that's the halfway point, Genesis 27, right? We haven't even got there yet. No! You can see how this continues. There's actually 12 Torah portions, so that the Hebrews divide Genesis by 12 and get 6 portions. They're not even, but the 6th portion ends at Genesis 28. And so the halfway point must be where the 7th begins at Genesis 28, verse 10, right? You get the idea. There isn't only one and only one correct response to the question, what's the halfway point in Genesis? It entirely depends on our perspective. In fact, since the chapter breaks came last, and they're entirely man's invention, we could argue that calling Genesis 26 the halfway point would actually be the least accurate of all of the options listed above. So just a reminder that Bereans need to learn to look at the text from many angles. And when we can view it from a different vantage point, we might come up with a totally different but still valid and defendable interpretation. I go into all this because a lot of our teaching is that there is only one and only one correct answer, but we're learning that this is not the case. If you look at the text a little bit differently, we weren't there, so we have to allow for plausible alternatives. And so that's just kind of trying to dig into the text and dig out the many layers that it might be trying to teach us. Now, this is not to say that anything goes, because using these examples, there are 49 chapters, 1,532 verses, 32,045 words, and 78,063 letters that are not halfway points, so they're not valid in that respect. So we learn as Bereans to exclude obvious incorrect conclusions, but from the options that remain, we can explore the layers. So challenge is to be a Berean, look at things from a little bit different perspective. Now let's get into Genesis 26. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. So as Western readers, we might be tempted to read these identical stories of Abraham and Isaac with some suspicion. We note the similarities. Each married a barren woman, each had 2 sons, each saw his inheritance pass over the chronological firstborn, and it went to the younger son. Each faced famine, each went to Gerar, each met this guy named Abimelech, each tried to pass his wife off as his sister, and so on and so forth. So to the ancient reader, though, this would simply be Isaac acting out his role as Abraham's successor. So they would have no problem with this repetition. In fact, Lancaster writes, the repetition of Abraham's stories in Isaac's life confirms Isaac as the rightful heir of Abraham. And potentially Isaac was trying to maintain the peaceful treaty with Abimelech, we might call him Abimelech the second, that Abraham had with Abimelech the first. But it appears that based on God's response, that Isaac may not have been as well received as he might have hoped, because the next line is going to be God intervening and saying, don't keep going to Egypt, stay right here. And the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt, stay in the land of which I shall tell you. Live for a time in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all of these lands. I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. So once again, we see that Isaac is prohibited from leaving the promised land, just like in Genesis 24, when the servant asked Abraham, should I bring Isaac up to Haran, to the place of your relatives? Abraham says, no, do not take my son up there. Bring the bride back here. So Isaac is a type of a burnt offering, and we looked at in Genesis 24 about how a sacrifice is actually invalidated if it's taken out of its prescribed area. So Isaac can never leave, in this respect, the boundary of the Holy Land, because he was offered as a type of a burnt offering. Jesus, after his sacrifice, also never left the Holy Land, and presumably he will never leave the boundaries of Israel as we think of it. So he ascended from the Mount of Olives. He's going to return to the Mount of Olives. He's going to take up his throne in Jerusalem, where all of the nations will come to bring him tribute. And we're going to see that parallel with Isaac in this chapter. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and I will give your descendants all these lands. And by your descendants, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and fulfilled his duty to me and kept my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So Isaac lived in Gerar. Very interesting statement here. We often think of the Torah as being given through Moses, but this verse here tells us that Abraham also kept God's laws, God's Torah. And what exactly this consists of, we can't be sure. But in any case, Isaac inherited the blessing on the basis of Abraham's favor. Abraham kept his commandments, kept the Lord's commandments, and then Isaac received the blessing. So in the same way, we inherit blessings based on Jesus' favor. Jesus kept the law perfectly. We see something missing here between verses 5 and 6. In chapter 25, we're told that the Lord answered Isaac's prayer for Rebekah. But here in chapter 26 is the first time we're told that the Lord audibly spoke to Isaac. Now, whenever this happened to Abraham, you might recall, did a very specific act. He always built an altar. Isaac does not do that here. He will do that a little bit later in the chapter. But to me, there's a potential sign of a problem here, because Isaac doesn't build, we're not recorded anyway, that Isaac built an altar. And so maybe this is a sign that Isaac's priorities aren't quite aligned with what God would want from him. So this thought of Abraham, we want to think of his promise as unconditional. And I might say it's unconditional-ish. In the sense that Abraham didn't do anything to merit the blessings. He wasn't a party to the covenant that we looked at earlier, yet in Genesis 26, God says, all of the nations shall be blessed because Abraham obeyed me, fulfilled his duty, kept my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So I guess the question is, was this a free gift, or did Abraham have to merit favor based on his behavior? And even though it seems contradictory, the older I get and the more I look into this, the more I get comfortable saying the answer to that question is yes. It's both. It was a free gift, and he obeyed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So what is clear is that Abraham's faith was demonstrated by his works of being obedient to God's commands. James chapter 2 goes into this in quite detail. Philippians 2 says, "So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, both to desire and to work for his good pleasure." So people might ask, if Abraham did not obey, would he then have forfeited the blessing? And I don't know. But I think it's the same as if someone gave you a gift of 1,000 pounds of pure gold and you dumped it in the ocean, and then you ask, is there a problem with this? I think such an act probably would indicate one is not worthy of the precious gift of salvation. So I do think it's both. We're not told to, you're once saved, always saved, so just go live as you want. We're told to work out your salvation. I do believe we can support the act of justification is once saved, always saved. But then there's this other word called sanctification. And this is a $10 word that simply means living out your moment-by-moment choices, and you're choosing to live for God instead of live for yourself. And we're going to do well in that area some days and not so well in other days, or maybe it's not even days, it's minute by minute. So I think the disciple, the Talmidim, the Talmud works out his or her salvation and does not take it for granted. So we really have to grapple with this mystery. It's a free gift, and yet we are counted righteous by our works and our obedience to that as a response of that faith. And so I think it's maybe a bit more dynamic than we like to think. We want to think of it as black and white. I think it's a mixture of both. It's a free gift, and we have to work out our salvation. Gerar we looked at previously. This is the location of Genesis 20 and the previous interaction between Abraham and Abimelech. Call him Abimelech the first. It's where Hagar was cast out. It's possibly where Isaac was born. What's interesting is you can see on the map, it's very close to the coast. So it's in the coastal plain. And this is the region that will be Philistine territory by the time of the judges and the kings. And geographically, it's not the area of blessing. One reason is you can't defend it. It's all flat. The area where God wants his people, which coincidentally is easily defended because it's in the hill country, is it's in the area marked by the yellow lines. So it's almost as if we'll see as the chapter moves on that as God is pushing Isaac out of this comfortable territory back towards Beersheba, where he wants his people to be. So the land of blessing is really, it's the land of Israel totally, but specifically it's the hill country, going from Jerusalem, Hebron, down to Beersheba, and even up north into Samaria, where we're going to see where Jacob has a lot of activity up through there. So God gives Isaac a beautiful promise here, and it's interestingly enough is followed by Isaac's deception. And so it's a lesson for us. Whenever we get a big blessing, we're often immediately tested to see whether our hearts are truly thankful and humble. And I don't think Isaac did very well here. When the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, "She is my sister," for he was afraid to say my wife, thinking the men of the place might kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is beautiful. Now it came about when he had been there a long time that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down through a window and saw them, and behold, Isaac was caressing his wife Rebekah. When we looked at Abraham, we studied those 10 tests that were used to build his faith. And then the times he lied and said Sarah was his sister, we could count those as failures. An unfortunate truism is that more things are caught than taught. So as much as we want our kids to follow our good examples and our words, they tend to follow our bad habits rather easily, much more frequently than they follow what we teach them. So it says he was afraid, and fear always tends to lead to making bad decisions. So a action point for us is let our decisions be faith-based and not fear-based. The world around us is crumbling in this day and age, and we need to remember to not have our faith so rooted in the world systems that we act out of fear. Abraham at least told a half truth about Sarah because she technically was Abraham's half sister, but Isaac is full on lying here because Rebekah is really a distant second cousin. So there's that going on. Isaac wasn't even remotely telling the truth. This word sporting or caressing in some translations, we mentioned back in Genesis 21. This is the same word that we're told Ishmael mocked Isaac. So we're getting a sense that this word maybe carries a sexual connotation. So something that's totally appropriate between a husband and wife is totally inappropriate in any other circumstance. So whatever Ishmael did, it had to be bad. And so we're getting a clue based on the word use here. It's interesting, I don't know what we make of this, but the earlier Abimelech learned of Abraham and Sarah through a dream. God had to appear to him. But this Abimelech learns about Isaac and Rebekah basically by being a peeping Tom, right? So he was his own eyewitness to Isaac and Rebekah being married. So I don't know what we make of that. I found it interesting that immediately God appeared to the first Abimelech in a dream, and yet here we're told that it had been some time had passed. So who knows how long they'd been pulling off this ruse until finally they got caught. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Behold, she is certainly your wife, so how is it that you said she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I thought otherwise I might be killed on account of her." Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon all of us." So Abimelech commanded his people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife will certainly be put to death." And the underlying Hebrew there is Abimelech saying, "I might have done this, and you would have brought shame on me," kind of thing. So somewhat inexplicably, again, the one telling the lie bears no immediate consequence, although I'm certainly reminded of 2 Samuel 12, verse 9, where Nathan the prophet is confronting David after a sin with Bathsheba. The King James Version, I love this translation. It says, "You have given occasion for the enemies of God to blaspheme." In other words, you blew your witness. And Isaac certainly blew his witness here. Now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100 times as much, and the Lord blessed him. And the man became rich and continued to grow richer until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household. So the Philistines envied him. Now the wells which his father's servants had dug up in the days of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up by filling them with dirt. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us. You are too powerful for us." So if Isaac inherited all that Abraham had, Isaac was already pretty well off, and now he's blessed even more. The Genesis Rabbah in the Jewish writing says, "Regard the manure of Isaac's mules more than Abimelech's silver and gold." So it's often said that if you're going into pasture land and you smell that wonderful smell of a pasture, it's the smell of money, because it's a reproducible crop or reproducible gain, whereas silver and gold is what it is. So the problem is he's on land that is not his own. And this Abimelech apparently, again, does not honor the peace treaty that Abraham made with the earlier Abimelech in chapters 20 and 21. So Isaac departed from there and camped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. So he actually doesn't go that far. But in a sense, you can see God pushing him towards the hill country. He's going to end up in Beersheba by the end of the chapter. So this is where God wants him. Then Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham, and he gave them the same names which his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley, they found there a well of flowing water. The herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with the herdsmen of Isaac, saying, "The water is ours." So he named the well Esek, because they argued with him. So it's interesting that in Genesis 21, Abraham had a good enough relationship with Abimelech to protest a similar grievance. They had signed this treaty, and we can read between the lines and conclude that the first Abimelech was actually grateful that Abraham brought the problem to his attention, because it was a win-win. If one of the parties to the contract was not satisfied, then the whole thing was a problem. And also when Abraham and Lot's men were quarreling, Abraham similarly proposes a win-win solution. Isaac does neither of these things here. He just concedes and he moves further and further away. And so it's interesting that of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Isaac is really presented to us as passive. Even in chapter 24, he's not the main focus of the action. It's Abraham and then ultimately Abraham and the angel and then God interacting on sparing Isaac's life. But Isaac is really just a kind of an unwitting participant in that space here. What he is, commended perhaps for not returning quarrel for quarrel, so he doesn't return evil for evil. He also doesn't look for a win-win solution, and I think that's maybe what Abraham would have done. Even in the famous turn the other cheek passage in Matthew 5, Jesus doesn't advocate passively moving away. He basically says, stand your ground, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn and give to him the other also. So in terms of a relationship here, I think we're going to see, and we also get a hint in verse 30, that Isaac and Abimelech did not have a good relationship at all. And we might wonder, perhaps this is because Isaac didn't care enough about Abimelech to cultivate one, whereas Abraham was always looking for the win-win. They dug another well and quarreled over it again, so he named it Sitnah. Then he moved away from there and dug another well, and this time they did not quarrel over it, so he named it Rehoboth. For he said, at last the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land. So Isaac and Abraham overlapped many years. So I think it's curious why Isaac didn't continue to defend and maintain the wells that his father had dug. So it's interesting there. A pastor friend of mine once gave a talk called The Three Chairs, and he on the stage he had a wooden stool, a camp chair, and then a recliner. And he was talking about how the next generation, from Moses to Joshua, and then from Joshua to the judges, they wanted more comfort than the previous generation. They weren't necessarily willing to fight for what they were given. They took their inheritance for granted. So we might see some of that going on here. Abraham had done all the work, and Isaac was just content to coast along a little bit and enjoy the fruits of Abraham's labor. But sometimes we must defend what's been passed down, whether it's physical land, freedom, or faith. We have to fight sometimes. Again, he's constantly portrayed as a passive player, and I just find this interesting. In Genesis 22, he only has limited words. He has no words in Genesis 24, and we just told in Genesis 25 that he prays for Rebekah. We're not even told what he says. So it really isn't until this chapter where we're getting a kind of a first look at what Isaac is made of here. In the next chapter, Isaac is even the unsuspecting victim of the ruse between Jacob and Rebekah. So again, he's being very passive. And he went up from there to Beersheba, and this is where God wants his people in that section of the promised land. The Lord appeared to him, and the same night said, I am God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, I am with you. So why did Isaac have to be told, do not fear? Maybe there was a spirit of fear that was within him. That was a problem. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. So kind of maybe backhanded compliment there, not because of you, but because of Abraham. Who knows whether we should read that into it or not. So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord. Finally builds an altar, pitched his tent, and then his servants dug a well. So he finally gets things in the right order after God appears to him. So whereas before he'd been digging wells and no mention of altar, no mention of calling on the Lord, here God appears to him and he finally builds an altar. We talked a little bit about this before. It was a big theme on my recent Israel trip, but when you see this phrase conquer the land, it doesn't necessarily mean military conquest. So by pitching a tent, building an altar, pitching a tent, and then digging a well, Isaac is in effect conquering the land. He's taking it as his own. Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with his advisor Ahuzzath and Phicol, the commander of his army. Isaac said, why have you come to me since you hate me and have sent me away from you? Basically, why are you following me? They said, we have seen plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we said, an oath must now be taken by us, that is, by you and us. So let us make a covenant with you that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good. And it's like, are we watching the same movie here? What do you mean? You've done me nothing but good. You drove me away. We have sent you away in peace now. So we're seeing some spin here. You are now blessed of the Lord. And then he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. So to Isaac's credit, he's kind of letting this pass. Lancaster suspect this may be how apologies worked in the ancient world. They would never come out and say, I'm sorry, but the fact that Abimelech says something so that, both of them know that this wasn't true. They did not send him away in peace. They drove him away. They did not, did him no harm. They certainly messed with him a little bit. So it's interesting that Isaac would have interpreted that as a non-apology apology, if you want to look at it that way. Again, to his credit, though, Isaac does not demand a formal apology. And this passage has a hint of the Messianic kingdom. So Jesus is going to reign in the Holy Land, and the nations are going to come to him and bring him tribute. It doesn't mean they're disciples of Jesus. It just means that they're acknowledging his lordship. And as it says, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. In the morning, they got up early and exchanged oaths. Then Isaac sent them away, and they left in peace. Now it came about the same day that Isaac's servants came him and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, "We have found water." So he called it Siva, and therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. This seems a little puzzling, as Abraham had already named it Beersheba, well of the seven, or well of the oath. We can speculate maybe that well fell into disuse, so Isaac had been moved on, and maybe no one was tending to the well. Of course, wells have to be maintained, otherwise they will just naturally silt up and so on and so forth. Walton speculates that maybe in Abraham's day there was not a city of Beersheba, but maybe it was Isaac who established that city. It's interesting, the Torah actually gives us three different viewpoints on how Beersheba got its name. So each involves a play on the word Sheva, which means seven, or oath. We're getting all of this kind of tied in here with the city of Beersheba. Now this seemingly out of place postscript here. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beri, the Hittite, and Basemeth, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. So we need to ask, why is this here? We have to look forward to the next chapter where they're going to come and Esau is going to come and want a blessing. So we have to remember Abraham's command to the servant: "Do not let my son take wives from the daughters of the Canaanite in whose land I live." So he sent the servant all the way back to his family to get a bride for the son. And so one would suspect that the same prohibition would have held true for the sons of Isaac. Rebekah says in Genesis 27:46 about Jacob, "I am tired of living because of the daughters of Heth," meaning the Hittites. "If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Heth, like these daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me?" Now, she might have done that as a ruse because we need to send Isaac away, or we need to send Jacob away because Esau is not really happy with what happens next. Stay tuned next time to find out what happens there. But so we've got this hint, though, that Esau is not doing honor to his father and mother here. The custom of that day was for the father to arrange a marriage with the father of the bride, and so it appears that Esau is disregarding that custom, or maybe Esau had earlier requested this and had been denied, and he went ahead and did it anyway. The New Testament concludes that Esau had insatiable lust and was a fornicator, and that is from Jewish tradition. We aren't particularly told that in the Torah. It just says he took foreign wives, but maybe we conclude that he had insatiable appetites and needed wives to satisfy that. In any case, I think we can conclude Esau knew, or at least he should have known, that what he was doing was an affront to his parents. He was, in that sense, he was demonstrating his lack of worthiness to inherit the blessing of the firstborn. Because whenever you dishonor your parents like this, it's one of the 10 Commandments. So we've seen people lose their firstborn status for less than what Esau does here. In the next chapter, we're going to see the scene where Isaac is insistent still upon giving Esau the blessing of the firstborn. And so the question is, why is Isaac doing this? And we'll have to explore that next time. But there were actually 3 instances that should have confirmed Jacob was the rightful son. The words of the Lord, first and foremost, the words of the Lord to Rebekah, that the younger shall rule over the elder. I don't think it's plausible that she would not have shared that with Isaac. So Isaac would have heard the words of the Lord there. Then we have this legally binding assignment of the firstborn status. So Esau signed over his rights to Jacob, and that was formal, and it was a pledge. And then third, we have this affront to his parents that Esau does here. So that should have resulted in a forfeiture of Esau's status. So very interesting that we're going to see next chapter that Isaac still wants to bless Esau after all of this shame that Esau has brought on. So that will be our subject for next time. So next time we'll look at Genesis 27. We'll see you then.